In this video, I'm going to show you fraction division. And more specifically, I'm going to show you how to do a fraction divided by a whole number divided by a fraction, and then fractions divided by fractions. Step 1, you're going to draw a model for each of these numbers. So you can see here, I'm dividing 1/2 by 2. When you're doing fraction division, you're essentially trying to figure out how many of these can fit into this. So what's going to help is you have to make these into the same size parts as the original fraction. So I got to find a least common denominator for these two numbers. In other words, I'm just going to cut these two into halves. So I cut this in half, cut this in halves, and now we're going to be able to figure out how many of these halves fit into this. And I just put a little label here on the side. You can see 4 halves is the same as 2. So we're going to see how many times does 4 halves go into 1/2. And I can see here that it goes into this only one time. In other words, out of these 4 pieces, 1 out of these 4 pieces is able to fit into there. So I can see 1 out of these 4 fit, which means that 1/2 divided by 2 is equal to 1/4. Now let's take a look at example number 2. So I'm going to make a model for 2 divided by 1/2. So you can see here that I have 2 whole amounts and I'm dividing it by a half. And the question here again is trying to figure out how many times does this half fit into these 2 whole amounts. So to make it easier, what's going to help is since this is cut into half, I'm going to make these into halves as well. So I'm going to cut this in half and cut that in half. And I'm just going to put a label on the side. I can see that 2 whole rectangles is the same thing as 4 halves. 1, 2, 3, 4 halves. So I write it as 4 halves. So my question again is, how many times does 1/2 fit into 4 halves? So from here, you can see that it goes into it 1, 2, 3, 4 times. 1/2 fits into 4 halves. 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So that means that 2 divided by 1/2 is equal to 4. In this example, I'm going to show you a fraction divided by another fraction. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a model for this division problem. So you can see my model here is 1/2 divided by 1/3. That's my model right there. And in order to divide this out, you're trying to figure out how many times does this slice fit into this. And since you can see they're different size slices, what you need to do is find a least common denominator or a least common multiple of these two numbers, 2 and 3, in order to make them the same size slices. And I can see that if I were to do the multiples of 2 and multiples of 3, the least common multiple is 6. Therefore, I need to cut this into 6 slices and this into 6 slices. And after cutting this into 6 slices and this into 6 slices, I can see that 1/2 is the same thing as 3 out of 6 slices, and 1/3 is the same thing as 2 out of 6. And now the question again is, 1/2 divided by 1/3 is really asking you, how many times does 1/3 fit into 1/2? Or in other words, how many times does 2/6 fit into 3/6? So I can see here that these two directly connect into this one time, right? I could fit this into that one time, but then I have this extra slice left over, but I can't put both of these into this. I can only put one more of these out of that into this one. So this could fit in here 1, and then I could fit one more out of these 2 into this. So basically it fits into it 1.5 times. So that means 1/2 divided by 1/3 is equal to 1.5. And if you were to write this mixed number into improper, it would be 3 halves. And then you can see here, this is my last example, 1/3 divided by 1/2. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a model for this division problem. So here's my division problem modeled out. I have 1/3 divided by 1/2. And similar to the last example, you need to make them the equal size slices. The slices have to be the same size. So you got to find the least common denominator for these two fractions. And remember, the least common denominator is just the bottom two numbers, 2 and 3. Find their least common multiple, which I already did. The least common multiple of 2 and 3 will be 6. So that means I got to cut each of these into 6 slices. And after cutting them into 6 equal slices, you can see that 1/3 is the same thing as 2/6, and 1/2 is the same thing as 3/6. And then again, the question begins, or is 1/3 divided by 1/2, which means how many times does a half fit into a third? In other words, how many times does these 3 slices fit into these 2 slices? And by looking at this one closely, I can see that I have 3 slices here and only 2 slices here. All 3 of these do not fit into this. Only 2 of these fit into these. So I can mark it, right? You can see that this and these 2 fit, but that third one will not fit. So only 2 out of 3 fit. And since only 2 out of 3 fit, that lets me know that 1/3 divided by 1/2 is equal to 2/3.